Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing an early look at what the Sharks' forward lineup could look like heading into the 23-24 season. Now, usually when I would make a video like this, I would discuss not only the forward group, but also the defensive pairings and the goaltending tandem. However, this year, in comparison to previous seasons, it feels as though the Sharks actually have a lot of different and exciting options to play up in their top 12 forward group. On top of that, for the defensive side of things, the big question mark is, of course, whether or not Erik Karlsson will even be on the Sharks team next season. And so we need two different projections of if Karlsson is there and, of course, if Karlsson is not. That makes the defensive pairings look very, very different in either case. And so I felt the need to actually separate these two to really be able to go in depth about how exactly the Sharks lineup could look like heading into that next season. So let us jump right into it with the first lineup here. That is the one in black that I have written. This is probably the most depressing, which is maybe why I decided to write it in black, because it is, while not something that I would say likely, is something that is certainly possible, as you'll notice that there is a distinct lack of any sort of young rookie talent coming into this lineup, similar to what the Sharks ran with last season. Like I said, not super likely to happen, as I feel as though this season will finally be sort of the opening for some Sharks rookies to actually end up with consistent lineup spots, but we have to discuss it anyhow. So on the top line, I have Barabanov, Couture with Anthony Duclair, new addition there. Labanc, Hertl, and Zadina would make up the second line, then a third line of Peterson, Sturm, and Fabian Zetterlund, as well as a fourth line of Smith, Kunin, and Lindblom. So this lineup, there's no Eklund, there's no Bordeleau, there's no one like that. A couple of the new additions that the Sharks brought in this offseason, Duclair from the Florida Panthers trade and Zadina as the free agent signing. Zadina placed specifically with Tomas Hertl for that potential Czech connection, I guess you could say, even though there was like that interview that Zadina did where he's not super familiar with Hertl at all, and so it's not as though there's some sort of like friendship there or anything, but you never know. So I imagine that's going to be something, but also primarily because Barabanov and Couture were placed so frequently together last season that they built up some really strong chemistry, so I imagine David Quinn will likely try to keep those two together. But of course, the fact of Hertl and Barabanov ending up together and Zadina and Couture ending up together is very possible. Now, with the additions of Duclair and Zadina, this has pushed a couple of players outside of that top six. It primarily would be Jacob Peterson, who had an extremely strong look at the end of last season, but of course, because of the fact that it was in a very, very small sample size, he might not have the sort of seniority, so to speak, and of course the Sharks will likely want to give Zadina a good look in that top six. Maybe that's even a promise they made to him when they brought him to the team, and so I imagine Peterson starts off at the very least on that third line with the potential to work upwards. Of course, having Labanc here in the top six we know is absolutely not going to be a mainstay, because the moment even a single mistake would happen, David Quinn would be willing to demote him, and Peterson would be the first option to get bumped up. I have Zetterlund here also on the third line, just because I imagine they'll try and give him some opportunity. He was very good, or he was pretty good as a rookie with the New Jersey Devils, but then once getting traded to the San Jose Sharks was quite awful, and so even though he was brought back, I don't necessarily have a ton of hope for him, but the Sharks organization likely does, and so he'll likely keep a third line spot. And then when it comes to the fourth line, I have Kunin, who is really the only possible fourth line center option here if we're not going with any rookies. He was injured for the majority of last season, but he should be back and playing in the final year of his sizable-ish contract for the type of player he is. Smith, of course, also signed this past offseason, so I imagine Greer and David Quinn would like to integrate him into the lineup. And then playing with Lindblom as well, a player who again was a sort of oddly favorite of David Quinn last season. So again, this is a lineup that doesn't feature any type of rookie talent, something that I don't think is going to happen, but is certainly a possibility and thus must be discussed. When it comes to the next lineup, this is probably the one that I would say is most likely to be the Sharks starting lineup come game one. Obviously, this is heavily dependent on what happens during the preseason. Many things can change there with those few games and those few looks, but this lineup in red seems safe enough. So this features a first line of Barabanov, Couture, and Duclair again, with a second line of Hertl and Zadina being joined instead by William Eklund. He seems to be the rookie player who is the most likely to make the jump to full-time NHLer next season, and him being placed with Tomas Hertl, a player who can create that space with him, certainly does make sense. And I also feel as though Eklund and Zadina should have some pretty decent chemistry together. Eklund being more of a playmaker, you could say, though he was definitely trying to move slightly into the sniping, or at least more of a shooting role last season in the few games that he did play, while Zadina is definitely much more of a sniper, reason why he has a much larger percentage of his points on the power play compared to at even strength, compared to a normal player. Then when it comes to the third line, of course, everything needs to be bumped down slightly because of the addition of Eklund. So I still have Sturm here on the third line, very, very expected, playing with Jacob Peterson, and now it's Kevin Labanc. And then on the fourth line, I have Zetterlund moved down from third to fourth, playing with Cunnin and still Smith. I've actually bumped Lindblom out of the lineup because Smith is the new face and maybe more of the physical presence that David Quinn will want in the lineup. Then we have the lineup in green. This is getting, as you'll notice here in this video, I'm getting more and more liberal with the amount of rookie type of talent that I'm introducing into these lineup projections. So in green, I've also slightly changed up the top lines to just show off the potential combinations that the Sharks can go for. So on the top line, I do have Barabanov, Couture with Filip Zadina, and then on the second line, it's Hertl and Duclair with William Eklund. I feel as though the other one is slightly better, Duclair being on the first line and Zadina being on the second line with Hertl and Eklund, just because of that like playmaking type of experience that, or not experience, but playmaking type of play style that Eklund brings, as well as the sniper play style that Zadina brings, and then Hertl just being able to tie that together. But it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that Zadina is placed with Couture and Barabanov, and then Duclair gets an opportunity with Hertl and Eklund over a full 82-game season. Every single combination, it feels like, will probably end up getting tested out unless the Sharks actually find some very consistent success with any of these combinations of players, which is honestly kind of unlikely considering the Sharks are unlikely to have any real consistent success as a team next season. Then on the third line, this is where I introduced Bordeleau into the equation. Technically, Bordeleau can play in the top six as a winger, and it's possible that he is tried out in that place if, for instance, a player like Zadina doesn't really work out. But for a potential start to the season, I would have Bordeleau playing center, and honestly, him being on a line with Jacob Peterson is really not all that bad. And I've also put Luke Cunnin on this line. I had considered keeping Labanc there because that seemed to be the most logical thing to do, to have Labanc in that top nine. But I feel as though when you're on that line with Bordeleau and Peterson, maybe you want a slightly more physical presence compared to a Kevin Labanc. So I feel as though Luke Cunnin is a very good introduction into this trio, and especially since Bordeleau comes in the lineup as a center, it does free up the fourth line center spot for Cunnin to move out of, because Nico Sturm is, of course, the perfect player for that. So I think Cunnin would definitely complement a line of Bordeleau and Peterson decently well, at least in theory. And then the fourth line would be Sturm, Labanc, and then, of course, Fabian Zetterlund. If I take a look at the lineup in black, the two most obvious healthy scratches there are of course, Giovanni Smith and Oscar Lindblom, and so here the lineup in green, that's exactly what happens. Then we have the lineup in blue, certainly the most radical of the potential starting lineups for the San Jose Sharks, as I not only introduce Eklund and Bordeleau still into this, but also bring in Danil Gushchin. Gushchin only played a couple of games last season compared to the at least slightly larger handful that both Bordeleau and Eklund played, but Gushchin, in that very, very small sample size, actually looked very good, and perhaps even the best out of the three rookie players. And so him getting an opportunity, if things in preseason go well for him, is not completely out of the picture. And I feel as though he would be put onto this first line likely with Barabanov and Couture, as he had an opportunity on that top line in one of those two games that he did play, and it looked quite good. Then I would have the second line with Hertl, Eklund, and Duclair, and it is Zadina who I am kicking out of the top six. I still think Zadina, even in a case where Gushchin does make the lineup with Bordeleau, with Eklund, that Zadina will get an opportunity at some point in the top six. but he's also the most likely to get moved down because he showed when he was on the Detroit Red Wings that maybe he is not the most consistent even strength top 6 player possible. And so on the third line, I have Bordeleau, Peterson, and Zadina. This doesn't have that same physical presence that I had on the third line in the green lineup, which was with Luke Kunin, but I couldn't really justify putting any of these players really on the fourth line. You could definitely swap Sturm and Bordeleau if you wanted to, and then have a fourth line of Bordeleau, Kunin, and Zetterlund, but for now, I had Bordeleau on the third line, and you'll notice that the player who is now the healthy scratch for this one compared to the previous lineup is actually Kevin Labanc. I mean, he was a healthy scratch a few times last season. It is likely to happen again just based off of the relationship seemingly between David Quinn and Kevin Labanc. And so while I don't think it would be any sort of consistent healthy scratching, and I feel as though a player like Zetterlund could very well be an option if things continue as they were last season, but if there are really going to be this many rookie players moving into the Sharks lineup next season, there is bound to be some very interesting competition and some pretty big names I should put in quotes, that would end up being the odd man out of these lineups. So this is just, like I said, an early look at what the Sharks lineup could be. I'll obviously follow up on this video once we get much closer to season start, at near the end, if not just right at the end of preseason, before we head into an actual game 1 of the regular season. But for the moment, these seems to be the type of level of intensity in terms of introducing that younger talent into the lineup, from absolute zero bottom line in black to the very, very liberal use of that young talent in blue. Class dismissed.